The whole ecosystem of Yellowstone is being impacted by current climate change, and that climate change is coming from the increase in greenhouse gases in the atmosphere from primarily the burning of fossil fuels. Yellowstone's getting warmer. We saw big fires in 1988, and we're certainly likely to see more big fires in the future. We're seeing animals responding to climate change, adjusting their ranges. Wolverines are having a hard time. Grizzly bears are moving to lower elevations. White bark pine, this high elevation tree, has been impacted by mountain pine beetle infestations that have been very uncommon in the past, but it's being driven by climate and warmer temperatures. I can see the impacts of climate change in the places that I work, and of course in the region and beyond. So I'm very worried about it.
Ken Pierce mapped the Ice Age glaciation of Yellowstone in the 1960s. He did this through the study of landforms left over from the last glacial maximum, around 15,000 years ago. He mapped the palimpsest of glacial moraines crisscrossing the greater Yellowstone landscape, conducted radiometric dating, and documented glacial striations to determine the timing, extent, and direction of the Pleistocene glacial advances. Imagine the bleak post-glacial landscape of Yellowstone after thousands of years beneath kilometer-thick ice. When the ice melted, the landscape was like a blank canvas, waiting for new color and new life to take hold. That transition from a stark, lifeless landscape at the end of the Ice Age to the vibrant Yellowstone of today is where the paths of Ken Pierce and Cathy Whitlock crossed. Cathy is a paleoecologist who studies evidence for past climates and to help understand today's climate and predict future climate change in our world.
I'm both a paleoecologist and a paleoclimatologist, so let me tell you how I see that. I'm interested in how present-day ecosystems developed, especially after the last ice age. How did they form? What were the first species to come in? How have they changed? But I am a paleoclimate person because in that information is climate information. In the information about how the ecosystem developed, there is climate. When the ice left Yellowstone, ecologically it was ground zero. There was no soil, there were no trees, there were no animals, there were no lakes. So all of that had to have formed after the ice left. And so in paleoecology, then for me, what I think about is how did that landscape evolve? What were the first things that happened? Which plants came in first? When did the lakes form? How significant was soil development in shaping that landscape?
When Ken Pierce first mapped Yellowstone glaciation in the 1960s, he was puzzled by a deep, water-filled depression in the Black Canyon of the Yellowstone River, named Crevice Lake. The lake has no inlet or outlet, and Ken called the lake an enigma. He theorized that it might be a kettle lake, formed by a chunk of glacial ice that wedged into the Black Canyon during a massive Yellowstone flood at the end of the Ice Age. A kettle lake forms when a sérac or piece of a glacier breaks off and is buried by glacial debris. The ice eventually melts to form a depression which fills with water. Ken hadn't ruled that out. The other theory that he considered was that the lake depression was an erosional feature gouged out by a swirling 300-foot deep vortex of water and debris during a post-glacial Yellowstone flood. In the mid-1980s, Cathy Whitlock was looking at the same lake, but for different reasons.
And Crevice Lake was unique because it has no inflow or outflow, and it's extremely deep. It's over 100 feet of water. So the bathymetry of the lake, the profile of the bottom, is really shaped like a cone. That's really unusual anywhere, including Yellowstone. And because it was so deep and the surface area is relatively small, it had the capacity to have no oxygen at the very bottom of the lake, or limited oxygen, because most lakes are oxygenated all the way to the bottom because winds and temperature changes during the year kind of mix the water column. But if you're so deep, there's probably the deep part that isn't affected, and when that happens, when there's no oxygen at the bottom, there's no critters to stir up the sediment. So most of the cores that I get from lakes, the mud just looks like kind of like brown toothpaste, you know. It's very homogeneous, there's not much going on. But when you get a lake where there are no critters to stir the mud up, then you can see layers deposited annually. You can see a summer layer and a winter layer of sediment, summer layer, winter, and go through time that way.
Whitlock had taken short cores at Crevice Lake and knew the lake was laminated with summer and winter layers. She was excited that this lake, deep in the Black Canyon, might hold the record of Yellowstone's climate and vegetational history back to the end of the Ice Age. The researchers put their heads together to try to understand the mystery of how Crevice Lake was formed and the climate history of Yellowstone since the Ice Age. Cathy hatched a plan to mount an expedition to take long cores all the way to the bottom of Crevice Lake, effectively to the end of the Ice Age.
Well, we knew we had to core Crevice Lake in the wintertime because it was so deep. Most of the equipment that I use in the summertime, it's a couple of inflatable rafts with a platform built over it, and then we're drilling between the rafts. And so that's good, but if the wind comes up a little bit, things fall apart. So we needed a really stable surface. So I knew we had to do it in the winter. And the nice thing was that the Park Service agreed to let us bring the gear by helicopter.
As Cathy was organizing the logistics for the winter expedition, Ken wanted to make one last summer survey of the geomorphology of Crevice Lake. He enlisted an old friend and former chief naturalist of Yellowstone, John Good, to join him on a hike into the Black Canyon to make a visual survey of Crevice Lake. On a hot August day, they hiked through the meadows of the Blacktail Plateau and down the steep-walled canyon to the river. In their eyes, this landscape was a geologic jigsaw puzzle. Every time they walked the terrain or looked at contour maps, they gleaned a little more understanding of what might have happened there. Ken and John used their decades of Yellowstone knowledge and observational skills to try to understand the origin of Crevice Lake and the surrounding deposits. One mysterious aspect of Crevice Lake was the bouldery gravels lining the sides of the canyon above the elevation of the lake.
Boy, we're really up above the river.
The first impression of many observers had been that these were lateral glacial moraines.
Look at the closure on this thing.
Hey, John, look at that boulder.
My Lord. And look at this one. The top of this thing is just covered with them. It looks almost like a moraine.
You know, 50 years ago, the only thing we could have called this was a moraine, but
That's right.
It ain't.
That's right.
You know, we have this nice low gradient ridge with negative slope on the back side of it. up against the valley wall. And this clearly demonstrates this is a deposit that's laid in here, and it represents the flood height of this big flood, probably multiple floods that came down the Black Canyon of the Yellowstone during late glacial time. And we're standing here 300 feet above the Yellowstone River. So this was quite a rushing torrent, 300 feet deep.
Ken had determined that the deposits were not moraines, but bouldery flood deposits. But how did the deep depression that became Crevice Lake form? In the last episode, we saw evidence of the massive Yellowstone floods at the end of the Ice Age. They occurred when ice-dammed lakes catastrophically failed, sending violent floods coursing down the Yellowstone River.
Further upstream above the Black Canyon of the Yellowstone, there's two places these floods may have come from. One is the Lamar Valley, including the beautiful section of the Lamar Valley where the ranger station is above the Lamar Canyon. And there we have good evidence that a glacier coming down Slough Creek advanced across the Lamar Valley and did dam the Lamar Valley. And so that glacial dam may be the one that failed, releasing a large lake that was in the Lamar Valley. Probably the level of that lake was fluctuating all the time. It was either building up, or once it got thick enough to get enough pressure to help float the ice and release the glacial dam, then the lake went down catastrophically, and then the glacial seal would have been reestablished and the whole cycle started again. The other site, it's a similar one. It's where when the Slough Creek Glacier was larger and blocked the Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone. And we have lake sediments in the Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone in the lower part of it. And we also have evidence of catastrophic floods coming out of the Yellowstone Canyon.
The remnants of the floods are evident by the giant bouldery ripples at the mouth of the Black Canyon near Gardner, Montana today.
Well, that's about right. The bubble's just a shade above the flat. So that's probably about the same height we are here. 300 feet above the river. Golly, you look at it now and it's hard to believe that we could have been this high with that same stream.
Yeah, looking down there at the river, that is a long ways down.
It sure as heck is.
Yeah. And this big hollow is all some kind of flood landform.
Yeah, it is. There's no stream in it.
Yeah.
And
it's big, but it's by no means as big as Crevice Lake.
And as you were saying, that beautiful bowl of a spoon shape, that you get deeper there and then shallowing out as we get down towards Crevice Lake.
So anyway, I think we got a little landform that is clearly turbulence. And we've already found bedrock outcrops out down here, so that we know that there's sort of two deep channels, one where the present river is and the other where Crevice Lake is.
Good place for a humongous eddy or something like that, or a vortex of some kind or other.
Big swirl,
Yeah. So we're talking about water that could have been, well, deposits are up at 300 feet, so it could have been 325, 330, 350.
Yeah. You need some tens of feet of water on top of it.
What a chaotic event that must have been.
It would have been one of the big natural events that just wreaked havoc along the canyon of the Yellowstone. Back then, they didn't have to file environmental impact statements about these kinds of things.
Just went ahead and did.
The snowy winter of 2001 arrived, and the greatly anticipated expedition commenced in late February at Yellowstone Park headquarters in Mammoth. The team tightly packed loads for the helicopter to ferry equipment to the remote lake. They made last-minute checks on their chosen methods to descend from the Blacktail Plateau into the Black Canyon. Everyone had their own way to get down the treacherous winter trail. Some snowshoed, some skied, and some walked the 5 miles into the canyon. As they made their way down to the river, the helicopter ferried drilling equipment and other gear onto the frozen lake. The first sight at the bottom of Black Canyon was the impressive steel suspension bridge crossing the Yellowstone River to allow access to Crevice Lake on the north side of the canyon. The Blacktail Patrol Cabin, where they would set up camp, was 100 yards upstream from the bridge. The anomalous nature of the lake was immediately obvious as the group made their way down the steep slope to lake level. First on the agenda was to survey the frozen lake to determine the best drilling location. They broke out bathymetric diagrams and cross-sections of Crevice Lake to help identify the part of the lake where the sediments would be deepest. They gathered test cores and measured water depth to the sediment interface in different areas around the lake in order to pick the best drill site.
Did you notice there was a dark area out front? Well, there's one over there, and then there's a darkish area.
They noticed several dark areas of potentially thin ice that they wisely stayed away from.
Let's try one here and try one there. You want to try a core? Do you want to try a gravity core? More ice than last year, huh? Okay. Lovely, lovely, lovely mud water interface, the whole chalupa. Okay.
Those look good.
Doesn't get better than that.
Okay.
There you go.
Upright for now.
So,
God, that's pretty.
see, it even comes off in layers. See how it's splitting? Pretty much organic material. It's produced by the lake. So you're looking at layers of diatoms being the light layers. There's lots of pollen in there, which will tell us about the vegetation history. Some of these tannish layers are probably freshwater carbonates produced along the margin of the lake. And the black layers are charcoal from fires in the watershed.
Once they agreed on a drilling location, they used the remaining daylight to set up the staging tent and drilling tripod.
USGS, this is 700.
We're on Crevice Lake and staying at the lower Blacktail cabin, and everything is okay.
With the first long day done, the exhausted crew meandered back to the Blacktail Patrol Cabin to recuperate for the night.
Upright tents.
Upright tents that hopefully will last the night.
Oh, goodies!
Real slow. Gosh.
Cathy Whitlock became interested in science at an early age, with a father who was a professor in the medical school at Syracuse University in New York. Later, as she pursued a geology degree at Colorado College, she happened upon one of those magical influences that rarely come your way in life.
I got inspired to get into paleoecology from my advisor, my PhD advisor, who I'd worked for her the summers before, and that was Estella Leopold. So she's the youngest daughter of Aldo Leopold. And she was a paleoecologist, and she worked at the USGS in Denver. And she was just, first of all, she was the only woman I'd ever experienced in geology. All of my professors were males. So here's this amazing woman who is so excited about everything, and also how you can look at the modern landscape and understand it by looking at the history of that landscape. I just was over the moon to work with her.
As the last of the split pine burned down in the cast iron stove, tired researchers drifted off with thoughts of millennial climate change on the high Yellowstone Plateau. The crew were grateful for the comforts provided by the rustic blacktail patrol cabin that had been built in the 1930s. Little did they know, in an ironic twist, a devastating 500-year flood in 2022 would sweep the cabin and its contents away. But not the memories of nearly a century of visits by park rangers and researchers studying the nuances of the Yellowstone geo-ecosystem. Back on the ice, the team began to assemble the sophisticated Austrian drilling rig.
Okay, keep an eye on that tape.
Measured 50.6.
Yeah, we can mark this. This is simply to make sure that the piston cable doesn't slip. It will slide up and down, being lifted by this small cable, and that will tap the core barrel into the sediment.
So we're almost 2 meters in. So 2 meters should be 2,000 years. Let's pull it up, let's pull it up. Here comes the fin. This is the first long core ever taken from Crevice Lake. So it is so exciting. So the types of questions that go through my head are things like, when did the forest form? How long has it looked this way? How sensitive is it to environmental changes? And to get that information, you really have to sort of leave the forest and go to lakes to look for it, because lakes are great repositories of environmental information. The sediments of lakes collect pollen grains, which tell you about the composition of the trees around the watershed, and that tells you about the plants that grew here at different times in the past. And the charcoal that's in the sediments tells you about times of past fire. The algae, including the diatoms, tells you about what the lake itself is doing, times when it's been really productive and producing a lot of organic material, and times when maybe the climate was drier. So to understand how Yellowstone evolved as an ecosystem and how it's responded to climate changes in the past requires that we get these long lake cores.
Soon after Whitlock started working in Yellowstone, the devastating Yellowstone fires of 1988 erupted and completely revolutionized her thinking.
When I first started working, I wasn't even thinking about fires as being an important factor in the park. And then the year of the fires, 1988, I was sort of wandering around the park trying to get my work done, you know, getting lakes cored and looking at pollen records. And you know, it dawned on me that perhaps I was really overlooking a major factor that causes vegetation to change, and that's fires. And so I left the field in 1988 thinking, there's a big element of this research that I haven't even considered yet. And so since 1988, I've been looking pretty seriously at fire history itself. What we're doing today and for the rest of this week is we are at one lake in particular, Crevice Lake, where we think there's a particularly long record. We think it's probably going to go back about 14,000 years to the time of the last ice age. And we're collecting the sediments from Crevice Lake. We're starting at the sediments at the very top of the sedimentary column, right where at the top of the mud-water interface, and we're getting cores ever deeper till we hit the bottom sediments of the lake. And the bottom ones, of course, were formed right at the time when the glaciers were leaving Yellowstone Park, and the top ones are formed today. So in between the bottom and the top, we have the whole history of the last 14,000 years. Perfect. Look at it, changes color right there. Look at that, look at that.
Oh, look how nice it is in there.
Let's see. All right.
So,
Look at that. Oh my gosh. This is too great.
Here's the little clamshell or ostracite.
191.0
Right.
recovered.
So that's why it's really important to keep recovery as a number here, but we need to cross that number off
Right.
and change it to,
to 29.93.
yeah, you can just cross out the second number and write it. In the last 15 years around the West, we've experienced these really large stand replacing fires. And the question that's arisen is this a result of management, perhaps fire suppression, or is it a result of climate change? And one of the ways of knowing that is to really look at the precedence of forest fires. How often do they occur? How closely are they tied to drought events? Are we really looking at something that's the result of National Park Service activities? You can't answer that question without having longer records that go back in time to see the linkages between fire and climate. Yeah, the oldest radiocarbon date that we got indicated that the cores that we got were 9,400 years old. So they're not as old as the flood event that Ken has documented with cosmogenic dating of the rocks in those large megaripples. The early Holocene had very wet winters, but warm summers. That was the period from 9,400 years ago to about 5,000 years ago. And then the more recent period, the last 5,000 years ago, it's been cooler and wetter in the summers. You have the climate story, but then superimposed on that is a geology story about having to do with the soils and the fertility of the soils. A lot of the early history is quite similar across the park, with one exception, and that's the central plateau, which is underlain by rhyolite. And rhyolite is very infertile, it's very well drained, most trees don't like it. There's only one tree that really does well there, which is lodgepole pine. And so while the rest of the park was going through a tundra period, and then you have spruce, fir, whitebark pine, the central plateau was just grassland. There were no trees growing there. The trees just couldn't get established. So when lodgepole pine moves in, about 11,000 years ago, it shows up there and it shows up everywhere. It's a species that has, we call it serotinous cones, or serotiny is the process. The cones are closed and the seeds are embedded in that cone. They're sealed with resin. And so for the seeds to be released, the resin has to be heated up and allowing the cones to open and the seeds to drop. So lodgepole pine gets a jump start over every other tree. When a lodgepole pine forest burns, those cones open up because of heating, the seeds drop, and already the next year you can see little lodgepole pine seedlings coming up, taking over. And we can still see that from the 1988 fires. There's some places that are just so dense with those seedlings. We know that was lodgepole pine that burned. Well, whitebark pine forms a real forest at high elevation. So we think of it as a high elevation tree, although it's possible to see little seedlings all around the park. And so That upper tree line, dominated by whitebark pine, is climate sensitive. And when it's warmer, the trees will grow to a higher elevation, and when it's colder, those trees will die and the tree line will be at a lower elevation. So what Ken was able to show is that you find these old logs that are growing above the elevation of whitebark pine forests today.
We're actually above timberline by quite a bit here. You can see the trees down there a ways. And we dated a couple of these from this area. And I think one came out 900 AD and the other 1100 AD.
And so that tells you that those logs grew there when the climate was warmer and the tree line was at a higher elevation. And his forest dated to the medieval climate period when it was, we know around the west that it was warmer than it is today, or at least as warm as it is now that we're into a industrial climate. Well, the tree ring people identified the last fires, especially in central Yellowstone, being about 1690 to 1730, kind of in there. And that's partly because that's the age of the oldest trees. So those lodgepole pine established with their cones opening up after that fire. So we knew that was a big fire year. And we can see in the sediments peak in charcoal in many of the lakes from that area that confirm for us that first of all, that our charcoal method works, and that in fact that was a big fire event. And so then the tree ring record stops because there aren't many trees older than that. And then we go back in time looking for other peaks of charcoal in the sediments that can tell us about big fire events. You're pretty much alone when you were a woman in science back in the 70s and 80s. I was the only woman in my class in geology in college. There were no women professors. I got a chance to work with Estella Leopold, which was really a breath of fresh air. But then you move into graduate school and it's kind of the same thing, but it's funny now, there's more and more women undergrads and graduate students in earth sciences. So the pendulum's really swinging, and that's pretty exciting. People have become more and more specialized. The field is so big and so complicated that you really have to sort of be specialized in something. But on the other hand, most big problems related to the earth and how it's changing are interdisciplinary problems that involve climate, people, oceans, land. So you have to be working with big groups of people to solve the questions that are facing us now. People, I think, are going to have to really adapt to climate change or they're going to be in pretty serious shape. And so who does that involve? Well, it involves the poorest people. It involves people that are living on coastlines with sea level rise, people who are living in Arctic areas where the permafrost is melting, people that live in fire-prone landscapes. It's the vulnerable people are the people that live in poverty, have poor health, can't adjust, can't accommodate. I think the wealthy countries and the wealthy people will adapt and survive, and they're also the ones that are responsible for the problem. So there's a real climate justice issue, I think, that we all need to pay attention to. I think one of the things that makes Ken extraordinary is he shows how much a person can accomplish in their life if they have the luxury of focusing in one single place and go out there every summer and hike somewhere new and beat up rocks in some new place. You know, he was able to do that in his career, and so as a result we just know so much more about the geologic history of Yellowstone than we ever would have, if he had been sort of sent somewhere else to do work.